So, um, my name's Jack Nunn, and I'm Director of Science for All, and I'll be talking to you for a little bit today about participatory action research. This will be in English. I will speak slowly. If I'm speaking too fast, please let me know. And as this is a participatory research topic, we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. So I'll talk for 20-25 minutes. And then we'll open this up into a discussion where we can share some ideas, ask some questions. So the aims of this presentation, it's to explore the concept of participatory action research. So what is it? What do we mean when we say these words? And ways of planning, reporting, and evaluating the process. And that's going to be a big focus of the presentation. That link below, scienceforall.world/events, if you go to that link at any point during this presentation, you can download the PowerPoint. Skip ahead if you're so inclined. There's also a resource I've created where all the citations and references for everything I'm going to say are there. And that's all under Creative Commons, so you can all use it, adapt it as you like. And there's other bits and pieces on that link as well. So scienceforall.world/events. After this presentation, hopefully you'll be able to explain what participatory research is, but also the importance of evidence-informed participatory methods. So in other words, how do we know what works? And how do we get to know what works? I'm going to talk about how I've used participatory research in some research I've been involved in, either in leading or in working in projects. And talk about ways that it can be planned, reported, and evaluated using standardized data on initiatives, or STARDIT for short, and how you can all get involved in co-developing STARDIT. So yeah, that's hopefully what you'll have today. I've mentioned the timings already. The main point is after about 25 minutes, there'll be an open discussion, and that's a chance for you to share questions, thoughts, and ideas, and you will be able to speak rather than just type. Just very briefly, who am I? It's a question you might very well be asking. So I'm the founder and director of the charity Science for All. I'm also currently finishing a PhD at the Department of Public Health at La Trobe University, where I'm currently exploring genomics research and how people can be involved in shaping the future. I've worked for over 10 years to involve patients and the public in health and social care research. And other things I work on at the moment include, I sit on the Medical Services Advisory Committee for the Department of Health in Australia. I'm on the editorial board for a couple of journals, including the Wiki journals run by Wikipedia, open access and free to publish in. And I'm the strategy liaison for the Wiki journals. That was supposed to bring me out to Berlin this April. Regrettably, that didn't happen. And I'm a member of the Cochrane Advocacy Advisory Group. So those are some of the sorts of things I'm doing. I've asked some of you to share who's in the room. We've had a brilliant introduction from Jenny, and it's lovely to at least read from you, Jenny, and nice to know you're at the other end of the world listening. So for everyone else, just you can be thinking about this while I carry on talking, but how would you describe yourself? Do you have a label that you would attach to yourself? Researcher, citizen, someone planning a grant application? And anything you're hoping to learn from this. And really the answers from that will just help me make sure I focus what I'm going to talk about to make sure it suits you. So defining participatory research. So I'm going to be talking in English today. And participatory research in English is an umbrella term which sort of describes a lot of different related approaches. And this definition I like, an approach where research is carried out with people rather than on them. And that's adapted from Involve in the UK, and that Wikidata definition I updated myself recently, Wikidata and Wikipedia being participatory forms of knowledge, knowledge sharing. Other terms include community-based participatory research, co-design, forms of public involvement. They're all kind of related. And in German, we might say, and I did practice this earlier, but please forgive me those German speakers amongst us, participative Aktionsforschung is how we might say participative action research in German. The point is, there's lots of different words to describe kind of related concepts and philosophies, and that's interesting, but also a challenge. I'm going to say participatory research, and that refers to all these variations of these different methods. But But essentially, it's research with communities that emphasizes participation and action. It's trying to understand the world by trying to change it collaboratively. And it emphasizes collective inquiry and experimentation. The reason I put a picture of a water pump there, I'm interested if anyone can recognize that water pump on the chat. It's a very famous one. John Snow did a lot of research when there was a cholera outbreak in London. No one knew what caused cholera, no one knew anything about it. He did a lot of very difficult and important research and basically tracked it down to this water pump. The point is, he didn't stop there and go, well, I found the cause of cholera. I'm now going to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal that will be read by 10 people and put on a shelf. He went and took the handle off the water pump and stopped people using it. That is very early public health research and very early action research. And I think that's the point, is that you don't just sit there as a detached researcher and say, here are some problems. You work with communities to create a solution. Now, that was a short-term one. Of course, the long-term one was sanitation and building sewers, etc., and vaccinations. So these issues are collectively identified and solved. That's sort of the point. So I'm not going to talk too much about the background and the history, but this guy, Paulo Freire, is a bit of a hero of mine. He says to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. And his thinking was linked to what's called critical pedagogy, which in plain English is a view of education and teaching as a political act, that there's no such thing as neutral knowledge. Who does we know and what we don't know? These questions are fundamental to how we run science for all. So that was my cocker spaniel who just needs to leave the room. Come on, Molly. She's not interested in critical pedagogy. Hopefully you are. The point is that it actually challenges that assumption of that linguistic distinction between research and education as well, actually bringing those things together. That, you know, sometimes the intervention for a public health problem is actually education or what have you. So all these things are connected. I just wanted to show this diagram too. I like it because it tries to visualize time. It's adapted from a paper from the World Health Organization back in the 90s. The cone of possibilities. You know, we start here and then you go out, and the idea is to sort of talk about possible futures, preferred futures, probable, etc. You know, and you can all sit here and probably imagine possible futures and possible future political leaders and preferred future political leaders, etc. The point is, if we're trying to map preferred futures, how do we involve all of humanity, all of our species in doing that? If you only ask certain people, you're going to get different perspectives. So I guess evidence-informed participatory research is looking at that. How do we involve as many people as possible in mapping preferred futures and actually trying to get to those, and maybe even avoiding the ones that we don't want, you know, and I'm sure you can think of some examples like irreversible climate change, for example. So that's what we talk about when we talk about evidence-informed participatory research. One of the main issues is there's no standardized way to describe how people have been involved in participatory research or to report the impact of involving people. For example, you know, we involved people, they improved the design of the study and it achieved all these things. You know, this is great learning, but that's often lost. I led a scoping review with some other researchers as part of my PhD in 2019. It was looking specifically at public involvement in genomics, but concluded that developing a more systematic method of reporting and evaluating how people involved could help provide evidence to inform future policy. So that's why we created standardized data on initiatives, which is shortened to STARDIT, which is to try and solve this issue. So very briefly about STARDIT. The main issue is we need to know the who, how, what, and why of everything, really, of research, education, policy, international development. Standardized data on initiatives, STARDIT is designed to be used across all these disciplines. And all the data is open access. The reports are the reports and the impacts are open access. And crucially, it works across multiple human languages. So going back to my terrible German pronunciation, it's built in Wikidata. So if you look bottom right of this slide, we're working with the Wikimedia Foundation on this project. And if you don't know about Wikidata, essentially every word, let's say, participatory action research has a data code. And then that's translated into every other language, and anyone can help update those definitions. So it's a collaborative way of co-defining language across all languages, and it's a wonderful tool. So we're building START-IT in that, and it will help answer the questions to the right that I just summarized. And the crucial point is we're still building it. We've only done an alpha version preprint. We're currently working on a beta version, and anyone who wants to be involved, we'd love to hear from you. There's a link at the bottom, scienceforall.world/START-IT. And also, if you go to the events/events link, there are some more specific links there that I'll come back to towards the end of this, where we'll have a bit of a discussion more about how we could use this tool. So I'm going to share some examples today, some learning from different projects I've been working on. And those lessons and stories have come from a few different projects that I'm working on. So some of those projects I'm going to summarize now. So first of all, my PhD. I've mentioned the scoping with you already. I also worked across 4 different projects as part of my PhD. So one of them was the SPREE trial, which is Australia's largest clinical trial, about 17,000 participants. And that's an elderly trial, elderly participants where they've sort of watched them and given them aspirin or not given them aspirin, and to see what happens. They've got their genome sequenced in some cases and lots of other data. And as a starting cohort for a multi-generational study, it's enormous. So the question was, well, could we make this into a multi-generational study? And my response was, why don't we ask them? And so we actually co-designed with some of the participants ways of involving participants in helping us co-design what a future study would look like, which was a very interesting experience. The Aboriginal Personalised Medicine Project I've been a part of as well, and that was, rather than going into a community and say, we're going to do some research on you, let's have your blood or your DNA and we'll give you some results. We went in saying, we think this is a problem, that personalised medicine doesn't work as well for these populations. Can we work with you to co-design a protocol for how we might do this project? And the protocol included co-design methodology, and it was reported using START-IT. The final one I'll just summarize quickly is the half-siblings who share the same sperm donor father. So I started this PhD looking at genomics research and public involvement, and thought I'd better buy my mum a DNA test to get a bit of personal experience of what it's all about. And unexpectedly discovered that my mum was actually conceived by a sperm donor who actually fathered possibly up to around 600 different individuals, placing me and my mum and sibling in one of the largest single ancestor cohorts known on Earth, which was quite surprising. And I subsequently discovered, therefore, my biological grandfather was Austrian. So it was very nice to get an invitation from this Austrian organization. And I'll just take this opportunity to thank Ludwig for this. So that was the other group where we were looking and asking that question, well, how can we all work together to try and work out what the rules of engagement are for working with researchers? This group will be of interest to researchers for many obvious reasons. How did the group of siblings want to talk about, first of all, talk about how they might want to work with researchers? So it's delicate and complicated. And all these projects used START-IT to report how people were involved. I'm just going to pause for breath and just do a quick check that everyone can hear me okay, that I'm not talking too fast, and if there's any urgent burning points. I can't see any responses, so I'll carry on. Wild DNA. So whilst doing my PhD, I also started a charity called Science for All, which is a whole other story, really. And it really started by getting around a campfire with concerned citizens who thought that evidence-informed management of their local forests was not happening, and they wanted to improve the data available to the government in order to make decisions to help not cut those forests down and turn them into office paper, but to keep the old growth forest for critically endangered species. We found out about this technique called environmental DNA, and we thought we'd look at how we'd use that. So for those of you who don't know what environmental DNA is, if you went for a swim in a river, you'd shed some skin cells, and we'd be able to take a water sample and do a DNA test on that and say, okay, there's been some humans swimming in here and possibly some dogs or what have you. So that's essentially what eDNA is. We were looking at developing new methodologies to use it to look for species that live in trees and other species that were extremely rare and critically endangered. And the whole point of this is that it started from the beginning as a participatory project around the campfire. It evolved into using online spaces. We involved experts from universities, members of the community who volunteered their time, and the whole method was co-designed. The protocol was co-designed, and we're involving everyone in the write-up. We've learned a lot along the way, sometimes the hard way, and some of those lessons I'll be sharing with you for the rest of this presentation. So that's the Wild DNA project, and I'm just sharing that picture. That's Ziggy. So this was a night where we went out to try and catch mosquitoes. So the idea was every time we were looking, with our eyes or infrared cameras or what have you for these animals in the trees, we were getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. I mean, really, hundreds of them. And I was thinking, well, what are these things eating when we're not here? So we set up some mosquito traps and tried to catch mosquitoes, sample the blood from them to see what they've been eating. And this had been done before successfully. Unfortunately, we learned it was easier to get bitten by mosquitoes than it was to catch them in the traps. But this photo is the people bringing in their traps and giving us the data of what they saw. And that box in the middle there is some toffee from a home recipe. And people got a bit of toffee when they gave us the data, which is a small point about incentives for people who are participating in research. I'd consider that an ethical incentive, but just something to think about and maybe come back to. So we're now going to just go into learnings from some of the things I've been working on. And really, I just want to pause at this point to say that an expert is in the eye of the beholder. I don't consider myself an expert in participatory action research. I do consider myself, I guess, a practitioner. And I really think the important thing to say about participatory research is you're not going to learn how to do it by watching webinars and sitting at your desk and reading papers. You should definitely do those things, but you also have to go out and do it, maybe with more experienced people initially. But it's something you learn by doing. And so in the spirit of that, I'm sharing some of my experiences and reflections. As mentioned in the resource I've created to accompany this presentation, there's a lot of references to people who really are experts. And so please do read those and ask if there's any questions. Who's involving who? Words like participation and involvement can mean very different things and can imply different power relationships. An obvious example would be the government. It says, we're involving the public in helping us decide our policy. The public might very well turn around and go, the government are our elected representatives that we've chosen to represent us and our decisions. And we're involving them and letting them do that for us. Two different perspectives, both valid. While it's important to ask who's involving who, a more helpful question can be who is working with who, how and why. Who's not involved? Why aren't they involved? Conflicting, competing interests, or they don't have the certain expertise or experience. It's fine, but define it. And who is a stakeholder? It's a word that gets used a lot. I don't love the word. I don't have a better one. Someone who has a stake in the outcome of whatever it is you're doing. So who's a stakeholder and who's not? This is appreciated. That I can come in and speak my language in another culture. Being conscious of this stuff is important. So an expert is in the eye of the beholder. Another learning is valuing people. And look, this is true whatever you're doing, but particularly with participatory research. And this is very important, by the way. You know, working, I know there's some people in the UK online and you know, involved in the UK. I spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, do you pay people to be involved? How do you value their time? I'm moving away from these labels of researcher or participant, etc., and just saying, how are people being valued? How is their expertise or time being valued? Are some people involved paid and others not? If so, okay, but why? Is that transparent? Is it clear how these decisions are made and who's making those decisions? And are people supported in other ways, such as with training or emotional support? These are really important things to know at the start of your project and help try and answer yourself. And sometimes you might not have resources to pay people or to offer emotional support or training. That's fine. Make sure people know that. Make sure everyone knows that. Or apply for a grant and get some money. But just very important to reflect on how people are being valued. Boundaries, again, in any context, these are important, but they help make sure everyone knows what everyone else is doing, everyone feels safe and is supported. Who's doing which tasks? Why are they doing these tasks? Are certain skills or knowledge required? What aren't we doing? What's out of scope? And what support is there, as I've said? But also who's accountable for providing that? Because it's, you know, I've been supporting a lot of different student placements at the moment, and it's at the start of these student placements at the start of this year, we had lots of plans to go out into the forest and get them working in a lab, and that hasn't happened at all. And some of them have found it quite tough, as I think a lot of us have this year. And I've needed to be very clear for myself what support I can offer those student placements professionally and emotionally and as a friend. And these boundaries are very important to define and also make sure that you are supported as either a researcher or someone getting involved. And time, etc., is an obvious one, but you know, do people know what the time commitment is? Is this going to go on forever? When's Jack going to shut up? And when can I have my tea or my breakfast? And so in the resource, there's something called the 6 R's, which is just something to think about in whatever you're doing. Communication. I'll just say briefly, there's no magic tool or trick to this. It's hard work, it's trial, and it's error. And hopefully it's a bit of evaluation as well. And I just have that picture of the campfire there because getting around a campfire is a great way to share stories, to share ideas. We have people speak around the campfire, people who run synchrotrons, people who have Aboriginal knowledge. They bring it and share it around the fire. But it isn't a confidential space. And we also need those. And sticking to those boundaries helps create inclusive, supportive, safe communication. And I know people say safe spaces and safe quite a lot these days. But to be frank, when we say that, what we mean is free from abuse, free from harassment, and perhaps confidential or private. One of my research projects was an online discussion with people with a rare disease, and it was very important they knew that their identity wouldn't be revealed in the public domain because that could have incredibly serious implications for their health insurance, which would have very, very serious financial implications, very bad financial implications for them. These things are really important. You need to get your security settings right on your online discussions or what have you, just as much as you need to be approachable around a campfire or create those spaces for that communication. But just whatever you're doing, try and evaluate it and co-evaluate it. So ask people, how would you prefer to communicate? For example, on the Esprit trial, we found out that most of the participants who are over 70 were very happy to work online, and that was actually their preference, which went against the assumption of a lot of the researchers. But they said, we don't want anything to do with social media companies. We won't use any for-profit social media companies. And what Science for All uses is a platform called Loomio, which is open source. We host it on our own servers, and we can offer secure spaces, open public spaces, or private ones. And that gives us a lot of control. So these kind of tools are good to learn and adapt. But you know, we've tried Slack, WhatsApp, Google Docs, Gmail, all these things, and they're all good for different things. You've got to find that out yourself. But try and ask people what works and what doesn't quite regularly. And finally, transparent power structures. Who's accountable? Who isn't? You know, there's only so many people in distributed decision making who can be accountable. We've learned this the hard way. I run Science for All in an open and transparent kind of horizontal way. But at the end of the day, sometimes it's my name on a grant application or a legal document. And if things go wrong or if things haven't been done, I'm accountable, and that's right and that's correct. And it's a difference between what I have to do and what volunteers have to do. So it's good to make that clear and transparent. And if there is power in decision making, label it. You know, so we do that at Science for All. We say this is how all our decisions are made. This is all done in the open. These decisions are sometimes made confidentially. These decisions are made here. And what we've learned from people who've got involved is that a lot of people have got involved with Science for All because our values are transparent. We work not for profit. We share all our data in open access. They can see that it's not for any one person or organization. It's for everyone. And because we've made that transparent, more people have actually got involved. And we've had academics and researchers, we've had people share the genome of lead-beater possums and help us achieve world firsts that we would never have been able to afford to pay anyone to do. And probably if we'd have set ourselves up as a startup company, wouldn't have got. But because of our ethos, people have been willing to share that. And that's a really important learning, is make your values transparent and your power structures accountable. In a similar way, if there's someone behind the scenes saying, we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that, that can be a real obstacle in participatory research if that's opaque. So if there's certain things you definitely aren't going to do or stuff that's out of scope, label that. I'm just going to say who decides what is ethical, and leave that hanging in your minds. I've put that in bold because it's probably the most important question in this whole presentation, and certainly one of the main learning points from my PhD. There's no simple answer to that, and it's effectively subjective, but the power of the people who decide what is ethical is enormous. And the question who decides who those people are is very significant. I'll leave it at that. And a final learning point is using tasks, not roles, to describe what needs to be done really helps keep things focused. For example, I'd like you to read this document and I'd like you to give me some feedback on this presentation in the text one. If we say this person is the feedback coordinator, what does that mean? I don't know. It's sort of a bit vague and things can fall down the middle. So we allocate tasks and that works quite well. So having a task-based approach also helps when it comes to reporting who did what. So I'm got about another 2-3 minutes, and then I'm going to come into the section where we're going to open it up and have a bit of an open discussion. In sort of summary, there's lots of ways of applying the values and principles of participatory action research. The main point is that the methods must be co-created with the people you're working with. You can't just say we're doing involvement and if you want to get involved, get around this campfire in the forest on Tuesday. Maybe that would work for some people, but similarly you can't just say we're going to have this online discussion platform or this webinar at whatever time of the day is where you are. You've got to actually ask people what their preferences are, and that's what we did with all of the studies in my PhD, and it's a really important learning point. And StarDip, the tool I'm talking about, has a way of actually systematically mapping people's preferences, so you can actually show, however you've gathered the data, you can show in a standardized way people's preferences for this were this, people's preferences for that were that, and actually map different stakeholders. So the researcher's preference was to do it all online on a Monday morning. The participant's preference was to do it all on a Friday night in a bar over a glass of wine. These preferences can change, so that's important. And again, safe online spaces is more important than ever at this time of pandemic. So really think about how literate you are in that space and how you can improve that literacy and co-design those spaces. The idea of Vortex is in the additional material. It's basically just a simplified way of applying participatory methods that I've come up with. It's about 6 bullet points. And that's there in the resource if you want to look through it, and it's all Creative Commons. This is just a very quick diagram of the research cycle, which should hopefully be familiar to all of you. And this is just showing at what stages the StartIt tool can be used. So you can plan, you can report what you plan to do at the start. You can do some co-design, and I'll go into that cycle separately. You can do the preference mapping, and then you can update the plan. Actually, after co-design, we've decided we're going to do this, and then you can do it and update people with the StartIt report on that, and report at different stages. Finally, at the evaluation, where you go, well, this worked and this didn't, and these were the impacts. And then 10 years later, you can update it if there have been impacts 10 years later, which you can't do with a peer-reviewed journal article, or at least it's difficult. And just that little bit that was the co-design stage, this was just to zoom in on that. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail later, but you know, stage 3, for example, stakeholder mapping, you've got to involve people in helping you decide who's missing. The phrase I heard once was screaming silences. What are the screaming silences? Who are the people you're not hearing from, and why? And who can help you map who you've not heard from? And help you design how you're going to develop a communication plan that's appropriate. For example, we went to this remote Aboriginal community, and the people I was working with said, we're going to put some adverts in the local newspaper for the events we're going to have. And they said, don't bother doing that. The local newspaper costs $2. No one buys it, and it's crap. They said, put a sign in the shop window. Everyone walks past this shop at least once a week. They'll put a sign up for free. Everyone will see that. Because we asked them, we got that important information. And that's a very simple example of co-designing a communication strategy. Obviously, it can be more complicated than that. So that's really just talking about how StartIt can be used to help plan and report the co-design stage. So that's the end of my broadcast, my one-way input to you guys. And as this is a presentation about participatory action research methods, I now wanted to ask if any of you had any thoughts, questions, or ideas that we can share. And also, in particular, if you have any thoughts or ideas about standardized data on initiatives. Does it make sense? Is there anything you'd like explained more? And do you want to get involved? If you want to link to the resources, and in fact, there's a link to the latest version of StartIt at that link there, sciencerule.world/events. There's also these resources that you can download. So I'm hoping everyone can still hear me and that Thomas is still there. We're now going to try an interactive session. So we thought the best way to make this work would be if you want to say something to raise your hand. Thomas will then unmute you, and hopefully that just avoids people accidentally speaking over each other. And we'll try and hear from everybody, but do bear with us if there's technical trouble. So Thomas, I can see your face, so I'm going to unshare my screen, and let's go back to looking at each other. So that's my presentation done. So back to you, Thomas.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Two things I would like. One thing on our behalf. At the end, you will get a survey, and we would be very grateful if you would answer it, so that we know what was good or what wasn't, and can learn from this. You will get automatically and link to the survey at the end. And having said this, as already Jack has done, I would like to invite you to ask immediate questions. And if there are none, I would ask one question on my own to you regarding how you did find the participants for your project. So did they approach you, or did you go to them and find these communities? And maybe afterwards, I see we have a raised hand. We will look at this question.
Thank you. Great question, Thomas. I suppose I'll answer that in framing it as case studies. So case study, for those who aren't familiar with the term, can mean a lot of different things, but for my PhD, it meant kind of this population that we worked with. And sometimes case studies are called convenience case studies, where you work with the community because it's convenient. So in the case of the ESPRIT study, there were very clear participants there. They were recruited to an international clinical trial. My PhD supervisor happened to be the chief investigator for that study, so that was convenient. The sibling group, well, my mum was part of it, and I noticed she's actually on this call, so hi, Mum. So yeah, that's another example. I suppose the wild DNA one is more interesting because, yeah, this is where we're getting into this really important point here, which is public health. Let's say air pollution, right? Air pollution kills millions of people a year. It's a huge public health issue from one perspective. From another perspective, it's an environmental issue, and it might be caused by burning forests, which Australia is doing at an alarming rate. For commercial logging, not for fire reduction, bushfire reduction, which is a very different and very important thing to do. This is slash and burn stuff for logging. That air pollution affects people. And then we've also got, maybe the intervention for air pollution is education. And maybe the researchers researching air pollution, the experts, are just as affected as the citizens or members of the public. And also, air pollution doesn't recognize borders. So things like constructs like countries, labels like researcher are not too important when it comes to air pollution. What's important is, what's the evidence-informed way of involving people and trying to agree on what our outcome measures of importance are. Is it reducing extinction? Is it reducing air pollution? Is it reversing climate change? Or is it the economy? Or is it all of those things? And so these labels like participant and researcher can be helpful, but they've got to be co-created. And that was something we were very aware of with, for example, the sibling group. We asked them, what would you like to be called? Are you all siblings? Are you half siblings? Are you diblings? Is the sperm donor your father, or is it your biological father, or is father not the word at all? And making sure that the language we're using is co-created. Now that's easy if you're working in English. Doing that across languages. For example, in Japanese, there's no word for public involvement. The rough translation is involvement at the core of the research. But again, it's, how do these concepts, these important concepts, map across languages? And that's something we're trying to solve with Starlit. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully.
Yes, thank you very much. I would Barbara, you can now ask your question if you unmute yourself. Yes.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just to ask briefly, the current situation with the pandemic worldwide, how do you think that's going to affect the context of what you want to do with Science for All and research?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously we started off doing things like campfires and science and getting people around a campfire, and that was great. But from the beginning, I built the organization online using online open access tools. And anyone who knows me knows that if I can do it online, I will. And I think this is the way things have to go and have needed to be going for a while. And whether it's your doctor's appointment or getting involved with research, the default should be doing it online and then face-to-face if necessary. And that was certainly the results from the ESPRIT participants as well. We've got people traveling from rural Australia, and for those who live in Europe, when we say rural, we mean rural, like 1,000-kilometer drive, long distances. So if you're asking people to come to an event, it better be worth it, and they need to be there. Otherwise, if they can do it online, you've got to have a very good reason to do it face to face. And really, that's the stance I take with Science for All, is that everything should be online, transparent. And Wikipedia is a good parallel. You know, I'm the strategy liaison for the wiki journals, and I was supposed to be flown to Berlin by the Wikimedia Foundation, and that was a big decision for the Wikimedia Foundation to have these physical meetups, and they're very important. You can't beat getting around a table or a campfire with people, but the next best thing is this kind of thing. And thanks for that question. For those of you who haven't put the 2 and 2 together, that was my mum, who was a participant in the study that I was talking about. So some of you might have some questions for her as well. I'm just going to skip forward, Thomas, because I've seen a couple of other questions in the chat. So one's from Nissa. Apologies if I'm not saying that correct. Nissa, did you want to ask that, or did you want me to read that out? I'll give you a couple of seconds. And just in case she's gone, the question was, have you struggled to get people involved with citizen science and research projects? No is the short answer. However, I think the longer answer would be people involved is different levels. So people filling in a survey, people coming to an event, people gathering data for you, that's great. Having dedicated people who you can rely on to analyze data or know a project better than you or stay in it for the long term, that's very difficult, and particularly with volunteers. So I think that gets back to, again, for those of you planning participatory projects, about the budget. You know, there really are advantages to paying someone to do something and having them employed or what have you, because there's that accountability there. We've worked towards working with, I should say, student placements, and that's been really successful, and they've been fantastic. But I think the main thing we've learned is people want to get involved with our projects. The people who we've asked why they got involved have said because their values, their personal values, really aligned with the values of Science for All. And we created the Science for All values in an open way. So I think that was a big learning point for me, is people have to understand why you're trying to do whatever you're trying to do. What's the purpose? And if people feel that aligns with their values, you shouldn't ever struggle to have people get involved. Thanks for that question. If anyone else has any other questions, please answer them, stick your hand up. I can see another one from an anonymous attendee. And there's one from Jenny that's just come in. So I'll think about Jenny's while I'm answering the anonymous attendee, which the question was, as a PhD candidate, you're clearly a very busy person as the Director of Science for All. How do you manage your time to avoid academic burnout? Do you have advice for PhD students who don't quite know what they want to do after their PhD? Yeah, I started Science for All during my PhD quite deliberately, because I could see myself investing a lot of emotional energy into my PhD, which I think is a good thing. Whatever you do in life, investing emotional energy is good. To a point, I've had jobs in the past where I've put too much in, and that's burned me out and affected my emotional well-being. So I think I'm talking personally, I'm not giving advice here, I'm saying what I've learned about myself, just to frame this. What I'm saying is I very consciously invest my emotional energy in different areas of my life. So if one of them is hitting a bit of a roadblock, you can just switch to the other one and pivot. I have taken on too much, but the etymology of busyness is that it is a state of mind. And it's also where we get the word business from, actually. So remembering that being busy is just a state of mind. You can have competing priorities. You can have a list of tasks. But being busy is almost a bit of a role description. So be aware when you're doing that to yourself. And I think the only other thing I'd say is advice for PhD students who don't quite want to know what they want to do after their PhDs. First of all, don't worry. And I think that's most people don't really know what they want to do. I still don't. But I'm enjoying what I am doing. And the main thing I can say is just find whatever you're passionate about, whatever you're enthusiastic about. If you can find enthusiasm for something, I think the etymology of enthusiasm is from Greek, roughly translates as something like having the gods within you. So theos or thea, enthusiasm. Having the spirit of life, whatever you want to call it. But I'm not very good at anything really, but I'm quite enthusiastic. And that seems to have been enough so far in my life. And I think if you can be enthusiastic and spread that to others, everything else will follow. You'll want to do it, therefore you'll work at it, you'll get better at it. And but I'm straying into life coaching here, so apologies, that's not what you tuned in for, so I'll pause that one there. So I've got another question from Jenny, and I met Jenny a long time ago in Rome, actually, at a European conference, the European Patient Academy, EUPATI. And Jenny does some really interesting research, so if you don't know about her research, look her up. My question from Jenny was, do you have any practical advice on evaluating participatory activities? And the short answer would be, and I'm aware I'm answering this to someone who knows a lot more about this than me in some ways, so please do speak up, Jenny, would be to involve people in co-evaluation. So when we talk about co-design, we have to remember that design is just one stage of research. So co-design, co-doing, co-evaluating, and when we say co, who is the co? So making sure that you're not just saying, we achieved this, we did everything we wanted to, but actually you've involved the people who you said you were trying to help in saying, did it work or not? That's the main sort of wishy-washy response. I'm very happy to get into the technicalities of it, which would be things like outcomes, defining those, co-defining outcome measures at the beginning, outcome measures of importance to everyone, not just certain stakeholders. You know, an outcome measure of importance to a pharmaceutical company might be share price. Okay, that's just a fact. An outcome of importance to a patient taking a medicine produced by a pharmaceutical company might be quality of life. Those are very different outcome measures, and governments have to sort of sit in the middle and go, well, are we going to pay this much for this? And that's a lot of what we do on the Medical Services Advisory Committee. It's complicated. It's a moral maze. There's no right or wrong. But for me, unless you're systematically and as evidence-based as possible, including the perspectives of people affected by a condition in a decision, the decision isn't valid unless it's including those perspectives. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. And for me, START is the thing we've built to try and solve that. So yeah, and I should out Jenny as someone who's been very interested in START and helping us develop that. So Jenny's someone who heard about START, got involved, and it's wonderful to have her input. So that's just a little hint to anyone else on the call who might be interested. Thanks, Jenny. And did you have anything you wanted to add, Jenny? It'd be great to hear from you. You might have a story of your own from the research you do with young people. If you do, Thomas, you might want to unmute Jenny, but I don't want to put you on the spot though, Jenny, but yeah.
Hi, Jack.
Hi, Jenny.
Thanks. A brilliant presentation, by the way. No, I think, you know, as you know, I've got a real keen interest working with young people, and I'm struggling with quite a lot of literature that focuses in on adult involvement, as you can imagine. I know there's a lot of participatory literature on young people, but I'm really interested at the minute in that overlap with participatory practice and involvement in health research and research design. And I think the two get quite confused quite a bit, but we're talking about the same thing, which is why I love START. So no, I think in terms of the evaluation, I think that the important bit is you mentioned about that co-creation of everything that you do and being very clear on why you're doing that particular activity and what it is that you want to gain from that activity, and what young people or what adults want to gain from that activity of being involved in the first place. So no, I think you answered it quite, you know, well, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and lovely to hear from you. I'm aware we've got about 6 minutes left, but just to say to the word evaluation, it makes me think, well, it's got the word value in it, and it's going back to that question of what are your values? I got asked once, how will science rule improve the world? And I said, well, I guess that depends what species you are, you know, because we as a human might go, oh, well, we're saving the forests or we're saving humans, and isn't that great that we're curing human diseases? Well, that's great if you're a human. What if you're a tree? Who's speaking for the trees? And by the way, we need those trees for water and soil and all sorts of other things, not to mention biodiversity and their own intrinsic value. So without getting too much into it, you know, there's anthropocentric perspectives, and there are ecocentric perspectives. In other words, human-centered or environmental-centered, which speaks to the question that I was asked by Bob. That's my dad. Hi, Dad. Have I met any resistance to the methods or people or organizations whom values threaten? And I think it's not an us or them. It is, however, about transparently labeling those values. So for those familiar with Cochrane's methods, for example, if you're doing a good systematic review, you'll try and look at things like bias. You'll try and weight the quality of data and evidence. And you know, there was a systematic review by Lisa Biro and others that found industry-sponsored trials were more likely to have favorable results for the sponsor. Okay, now that might seem fairly obvious, but it's good that we've got the evidence about that. But that's a hugely important thing. The people paying for research are going to get the answers they want. That's basically saying. Now that's quite an issue if these people have vested interests. So I think things like StartIt are trying to go, okay, if you're the coal company or the pharmaceutical company, it's not about saying good or bad. It's just saying you have vested interests as a shareholder in this company or what have you. Air next to a coal plant, or drinking water out of a river downstream from a gold mine, or having, you know, Tamiflu, that your government spent billions stockpiling, which has absolutely no evidence that it's effective at all, according to a Cochrane review, where the pharmaceutical company actively withheld that data until they decided to release it. All these different examples are about a clash of values. And I think the best way we can try and solve it is to keep it transparent and open, and to empower everyone in the world to be able to label who has these values, and not just let those in positions of power decide who's involved. That seemed like a fairly weighty end. I just want to pause to say thank you for all those brilliant questions, and just to double check in case there are any other points or questions people wanted to raise. I just want to remind you all of the link to the resources, which I'll paste in the chat now. So that is where you can download everything I was just talking about. And I just want to thank Thomas for inviting me to do this presentation, and to Ludwig Boltzmann Geschaft, apologies for the translation, for the pronunciation, for inviting me to this presentation. So thank you everyone for your attention, for your wonderful questions. We've got 2 minutes left. Is there anything else anybody would like to say, ask, do? Should we have a group meditation in silence? Actually, that's a fine point to end on. We did a Campfires in Science event, and we were collecting data and eDNA data, and we had talks from all these experts. And I trained one of our team members to run these events, and I said, you know, you go and run this. I said, you design the event, I'll fly back in time for the event, and he did a great job. He invited someone to do a guided meditation through the forest. And I was, now personally, I love meditation, it's a big part of my life. I was cautious about being an organization called Science for All and running Campfires in Science and putting meditation into that. I was cautious because did those values merge or not? And it turns out, of course, all the evidence is that meditation is very important, or mindfulness, whatever you want to label it. Just shutting off this thing and this thing in here and listening and being. And when we did the evaluation of the events, we'd had speakers, we collected DNA, we'd seen platypus in the wild, all these amazing things. What was your favorite part? The forest meditation. And because we asked people what their favorite part is, we created the opportunity for them to say what their favorite part was. And I learned that was the most valuable thing, was building in time for people to be, not just to hear or listen or speak. And that was a very important learning point for me. And maybe that's a nice ending.
I think it is. Thank you very much. And also for all of you, you can find the resources and this video on our homepage. And I hope you get the link together with the email with the survey after I'm ending the webinar. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Thomas.
See you
Thanks
soon.
everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.